So how might Jack Smith's case, or perhaps cases, against former President Trump hold up at trial? Between 2010 and 2015, Smith led the DOJ's Public Integrity Unit of about 30 prosecutors investigating public corruption cases of politicians and others. Among Smith's more notable prosecutions, Democratic Senator and Vice Presidential candidate John Edwards on campaign finance law violations over payoffs to the woman with whom he'd been having an affair, and a bribery case against Democratic Senator Robert Menendez over unreported gifts from a friend in exchange for influence. Both those cases resulted in hung juries and mistrials. Smith's team did secure a conviction against Republican Congressman Rick Renzi of Arizona for extortion, bribery, insurance fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. In 2021, President Trump pardoned Renzi. My next guest, former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell, has a distinctly personal perspective on Smith. In 2014, Smith prosecuted him on charges of bribery, and a jury convicted McDonnell on 11 corruption-related felony counts, but the conviction was later overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court. The case concerned McDonnell and his wife accepting more than $175,000 worth of loans and gifts from a businessman seeking the state's help in researching a dietary supplement. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the court's opinion and said that the prosecution had taken a, quote, boundless interpretation of the federal bribery statute about what constitutes an official act. Former Governor of Virginia, Bob McDonnell, joins me now. Governor, thank you for being here. So you, John Edwards,
Thanks,
Robert Menendez, all failed prosecutions. What's the common denominator, if any, as it relates to Jack Smith?
Well, Michael, thanks for having me on. Jack Smith, Harvard educated, good career as a tough prosecutor, decisive. But those 5 years during the time he was head of the Public Integrity Section of DOJ, you just chronicled some of the cases with Menendez and the former vice presidential candidate John Edwards. Also the Lois Lerner, he was giving advice to perhaps go after conservative groups for IRS matters. My case, Michael, it's long in the past now, but we wrote a 38-page brief we gave the government in advance telling them why their theory of the case were wrong. We had amicus briefs filed by people like the former White House counsel for 5 U.S. presidents from Reagan to Obama, 83 former attorneys general saying why this was wrong, and yet, they persisted. And so, what I get out of that is I think he's been overzealous in some of these high-profile cases. He's willing to stretch the law. John Roberts called it a boundless interpretation that would catch up politicians in their ordinary acts that they do for people. And I think it's just says maybe a lack of judgment. And that's the concern that I get out of my case and the others.
Well, then why do you think he was selected?
Well, Merrick Garland made the choice. He also brought in David Harbaugh as, one of his top people in this case. Harbaugh was actually in the courtroom, gave the closing argument in my case, and was also in the Edwards case. So, again, there's some judgment questions there, but I don't know what pool or what the criteria he had to pick from. But, on paper, he's been a good public service. But in the courtroom and in the judgments, he said these failures. In my case, $28 million of legal fees and 3.5 years of great difficulty for my state, my family, my staff. I just think he's willing to stretch the law. And here's the problem, Michael. As a lawyer, the ethical rules are you're supposed to, as a government attorney, a federal prosecutor, you're supposed to seek truth and justice, not merely to convict. It's a very different ethical duty. And I think maybe that's been the downfall in some of these cases. He'd rather win.
And to state the obvious, two things can be true at the same time, that former President Trump should not have retained the 31 documents that are at issue here, and that Jack Smith is an overzealous prosecutor, right? None of this excuses Trump's conduct. We should make that clear. Yeah.
No, listen, I agree. I'm not making a judgment on the facts. If they can prove, if Smith and his team can prove that the evidence will support the allegations in this indictment, this speaking indictment, then I think Mr. Trump may have some criminal culpability. But, I hate having things tried in the press, Michael. I know it's never fair. There's always spin. The law's not clear. And so we're going to have to see how this plays out in the courtroom, because one of the sides is going to be really embarrassed when it comes to evidence.
To your case, Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion. It was unanimous. I'm going to put on the screen and read one paragraph for the audience not familiar with what he said. There's no doubt that this case is distasteful. It may be worse than that. But our concern is not the tawdry tales of Ferraris, Rolexes, and ball gowns. It is instead with the broader legal implications of the government's boundless interpretation of the federal bribery statute. A more limited interpretation of the term official act leaves ample room for prosecuting corruption while comporting with the text of the statute and the precedent of the court. Obviously, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, knew when appointing Jack Smith that the Supreme Court had kind of spanked him as it relates to your case, but he selected him nonetheless. Why do you think?
Boy, Michael, that's a question for Merrick Garland. I hate to pass on that, other than the fact that he's got, again, tremendous experience being in public integrity, making decisive, taking decisive action in high-profile cases, and tough enough to stand up against the President of the United States in the courtroom in a historic indictment. That would be my best guess, but he had to know he would subject himself to immense scrutiny based on really bipartisan mistakes, going after both Democrat and, in my case, a Republican person, and getting unanimously revoked. He got the law unanimously wrong in my case. So I question Mr. Garland's judgment in this pick, knowing
it's had a lot of reverberations on the prosecution of so-called public corruption all across the country. I'm going to put on the screen and I'll read aloud a social media reaction that just came in. Go ahead, Catherine. Let's see what it says. POTUS47, a.k.a. POTUS 47, a.k.a. Donald Trump, not 45, will not need to pardon himself. Let that sink in. Governor, quick question for you. What's the prospect that whomever is POTUS 47, Trump, Biden, Kamala Harris, Ron DeSantis, pardons Donald Trump? Do you think this ends with a Jerry Ford-like move?
Well, of course, that presumes he'd be convicted. Michael, my greatest concern is we have weaponized the criminal justice system. I think both parties have done it. The rule of law is much more important than any person or one president that might be elected. That's my broader concern, is when you do things, as in my case, getting the law wrong for whatever your motivations might be, you undermine the basic tenet of American civilization, which is the rule of law. No one is above the law, but everybody's treated fairly under the law. So I think that there might be, if he's convicted, there very well may be, because of the reaction to that conviction, there very well may be an act by a future president to do, as you said, that Ford did, and to create peace in our nation is to have a pardon. But that's a long way down the road. We have to see what happens, what's the real evidence, not in the press, but in the courtroom.
Right. Well, pretty compelling. That speaking indictment laid out a hell of a case, but we'll see the way in which the former president defends himself. Thank you, Governor. Appreciate you being here.
Okay.